The summer of 1887 in Tombstone, Arizona, was merciless. Dust devils danced across the parched earth as people gathered around the courthouse steps for what would become the most talked-about auction in territorial history. Margaret Sullivan stood on the wooden platform, her wrists bound, eyes defiant despite 3 days without food. The auctioneer's gavel gleamed in the scorching sun as he shouted to the crowd of ranchers, miners, and drifters. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. She's worth nothing. Troublemaker this one. Ran away 4 times already. Who'll start the bidding at $50? Silence stretched like a taut rope. Then, from the back of the crowd, a figure emerged. Tall, weathered, with long black hair braided with silver threads. The Apache warrior stepped forward, his moccasins silent against the dusty ground. "Everything," he said, his voice carrying across the stunned crowd. "I will pay with everything." The morning had started like any other in Tombstone, but Thomas Whitfield knew today would be different. As the territorial magistrate's clerk, he'd process the paperwork himself, the final auction of Margaret Sullivan's indenture contract. She'd been in the system for 8 months now, passed from one employer to another, each claiming she was impossible to manage. Whitfield adjusted his spectacles as he watched the crowd gather in the courthouse square. Word had spread quickly through the dusty streets. Margaret Sullivan was the Irish immigrant who'd caused more trouble than a flash flood in a narrow canyon. She'd arrived in Arizona territory with nothing but the clothes on her back and a debt to pay, passage money owed to the Brennan Trading Company that had brought her west from Boston. The system was simple. Work off your debt through contracted labor. Most immigrants accepted their fate, worked their required time, and earned their freedom. Not Margaret Sullivan. She'd run away from the Hendricks farm after 2 weeks, claiming they'd worked her 18 hours a day without proper food. When they caught her, she'd been traded to the Morrison Ranch. She'd lasted a month there before disappearing again, found 3 days later at the old Apache Trail, trying to make her way back east on foot. "Stubborn as a mule and twice as ornery," muttered Sheriff Bradley, as he positioned himself near the platform. He'd been the one to track her down each time. Don't know why anyone would bid on her contract now. The auctioneer, a round man named Ezra Polk, wiped sweat from his forehead with a stained handkerchief. He'd conducted hundreds of these auctions: farm equipment, livestock, property deeds, and occasionally labor contracts. But something about this particular sale made him uneasy. Maybe it was the way the woman stood, shoulders straight despite everything she'd endured. Or maybe it was the unusual crowd that had gathered. Among the usual faces, ranch hands looking for cheap labor, business owners seeking workers, there were others. Faces he didn't recognize. Apache faces, weathered by sun and wind, watching silently from the edges of the crowd. The peace treaty with the local Apache bands was still fresh, signed just 2 years earlier after decades of conflict. Their presence at a white man's auction was unprecedented. Margaret Sullivan had been brought from the jail at dawn. Deputy Clark had unlocked her cell and led her through the back streets to avoid the crowds that always seemed to follow her. She'd spent 3 days in confinement after her latest escape attempt. 3 days with only water and stale bread. Her brown dress, the only one she owned, was dusty and torn at the hem. Her red hair, once carefully braided, now hung loose around her shoulders. But her green eyes burned with the same fire that had gotten her into trouble from the beginning. She'd told anyone who'd listened that she hadn't come to Arizona to be anyone's property. She'd come seeking the freedom that America promised, not a new form of bondage dressed up in legal contracts. The crowd parted as Polk climbed onto the wooden platform. A portable podium had been set up along with the auction block where Margaret now stood. The morning sun cast long shadows across the courthouse square, and somewhere in the distance, a church bell tolled 9 o'clock. Ladies and gentlemen, we are here today for the final auction of the labor contract belonging to one Margaret Mary Sullivan, age 22, of County Cork, Ireland. Current debt remaining is $375, including accumulated interest and recovery costs. A murmur rippled through the crowd. It was a substantial sum, more than many men earned in a year. The repeated escape attempts had only added to the debt, creating a cycle that seemed impossible to break. Dr. Harrison Webb, the town's physician, stood near the front of the crowd with his wife, Eleanor. They'd been Margaret's third placement, and she'd lasted the longest with them, nearly 3 months. She'd worked as a household servant, cleaning, cooking, and helping with Dr. Webb's medical supplies. For a while, it had seemed like a good arrangement. She was actually quite capable, Dr. Webb had told his wife the night before the auction. Smart as a whip, learned everything quickly. It was the restrictions that bothered her, not being allowed to leave the property, having to ask permission for everything. And she said it reminded her too much of the workhouses back in Ireland. Eleanor Webb had grown fond of Margaret during those 3 months. The young woman had shared stories of her homeland, the potato blight that had driven her family from their small farm, the death of her parents during the crossing to America, her determination to build something better in the territories. When Margaret had disappeared from their home, Eleanor had hoped she'd made it to freedom. Finding out she'd been recaptured had broken her heart. The Webbs weren't the only ones in the crowd with complicated feelings about the auction. Father Miguel Santos, the Catholic priest who served the territory's growing Hispanic and Irish populations, had visited Margaret several times during her various imprisonments. He'd heard her confessions, listened to her fears, and tried to counsel patience and acceptance. But he'd also seen the marks on her wrists from the ropes, the exhaustion in her eyes from overwork, and the way she flinched whenever men raised their voices. The system is wrong, he'd told the territorial governor in a letter that had gone unanswered. We're creating the very conditions these people fled from in their homelands. Standing near the priest was Carlos Mendoza, a vaquero who worked for the largest ranch in the territory. He'd encountered Margaret during her second escape attempt, finding her collapsed from heat exhaustion near Willow Creek. Instead of turning her in immediately, he'd given her water and food and listened to her story. She'd reminded him of his own sister, who died young fighting against circumstances beyond her control. The crowd grew restless as Polk shuffled through his papers. Children darted between the adults, vendors sold lemonade and roasted peanuts, and somewhere someone was playing a harmonica. It felt more like a county fair than a legal proceeding that would determine a young woman's fate. But the Apache observers remained silent and still. There were perhaps a dozen of them spread throughout the crowd, but somehow connected by invisible threads of communication. Their leader, if such a term applied, was a man the whites knew as Joseph Running Bear, though that wasn't his real name. His real name belonged to his people, spoken in ceremonies and family gatherings, not in the dusty squares of territorial towns. Running Bear had been watching the situation develop for months. His band's territory included the traditional trails that Margaret had tried to use during her escape attempts. They'd seen her struggling through the desert, determined but unprepared for the harsh landscape. Some of his warriors had wanted to help her, but the peace treaty was still fragile, and interfering in white law could spark new conflicts. That had changed 3 weeks ago when Running Bear's youngest daughter, Little Hawk, had been bitten by a rattlesnake while gathering medicinal plants. The tribal healer had done what he could, but infection had set in, and the child was dying. Desperate, Running Bear had swallowed his pride and brought her to the white doctor in Tombstone. Dr. Webb had worked for 3 days and nights to save Little Hawk's life. He'd used every skill in his arsenal, every medicine in his cabinet, and had refused payment from the Apache father, who had nothing to offer but friendship and respect. When Little Hawk finally opened her eyes and smiled at her father, Running Bear had wept, not from shame,
but from gratitude that knew no boundaries of race or culture. It was Margaret Sullivan who had assisted Dr. Webb during those 3 critical days. She'd held Little Hawk when fever dreams made her thrash, had sung Irish lullabies that somehow soothed the frightened child, and had worked alongside the doctor with skill and compassion that impressed even the tribal healer who'd accompanied them. When Running Bear had tried to thank her, Margaret had simply said, "Children are gifts from God, no matter where they're born. I was just doing what anyone would do." But Running Bear knew better. He'd seen how other whites looked at his people, the fear and suspicion that still lingered despite the treaty. Margaret Sullivan had looked at his daughter and seen only a sick child who needed help. That was when Running Bear had made his decision about today's auction. The sun climbed higher, and Polk finally called for attention. Margaret stood straighter as all eyes focused on her. She'd made peace with whatever was about to happen. She'd tried to escape the system 4 times and failed each time. The debt had only grown larger, the restrictions tighter, the hope dimmer. But she'd never stopped believing that freedom was worth fighting for, even if she never lived to see it herself. "The bidding will start at $50, Polk announced, his voice cutting through the morning air like a blade. "Do I hear $50 for the remaining contract term?" Silence stretched across the square. $50 was still a significant amount, and everyone knew Margaret's reputation for running away. It seemed like a poor investment. "Come now, folks," Polk continued, wiping his forehead again. "She's young, healthy, and capable of work. Someone must be willing to start the bidding." More silence. Margaret felt a strange sense of relief. If nobody bid, what would happen to her? Prison? Deportation? Either seemed preferable to more years of bondage. That's when Polk made his fateful declaration. "She is worth nothing. Troublemaker, this one. Ran away 4 times already. Who'll start the bidding at $25? Surely someone will take her for $25. The crowd began to murmur and shift. A few men looked like they might raise their hands, calculating whether $25 was worth the risk. Margaret closed her eyes, trying to summon the strength for whatever came next. That's when the voice came from the back of the crowd, clear and strong, speaking words that would echo through Arizona territory for generations to come.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. Everything. I will pay with everything. The crowd parted like the Red Sea as Running Bear walked forward, his moccasins silent on the packed earth. He was tall and lean, with silver threading through his black hair and eyes that had seen both war and peace. Behind him came his warriors, their faces serious but not hostile. The entire square had gone dead silent. Polk stood frozen on his platform, his mouth hanging open. In all his years of conducting auctions, he'd never faced a situation like this. An Apache warrior was claiming he would pay everything for an Irish immigrant's labor contract? What did that even mean? And did he have the legal right to refuse his bid? Sheriff Bradley's hand moved instinctively toward his gun, but he caught himself. The peace treaty was clear. Apache individuals had the same legal rights as any other territorial residents when it came to property transactions. If Running Bear had legitimate payment, there were no grounds to refuse his bid. Margaret opened her eyes and found herself staring into the weathered face of the Apache warrior. She recognized him. He was Little Hawk's father, the man who'd wept with gratitude when his daughter had recovered from the snake bite. But why was he here, and what did he mean by everything? Running Bear reached into a leather pouch at his waist and withdrew something that made the entire crowd gasp. It was a nugget of pure gold, roughly the size of a chicken egg, gleaming in the morning sun like a piece of captured starlight. The golden nugget caught the sunlight and threw it back at the stunned crowd like a challenge from the earth itself. Polk's hand trembled as he adjusted his spectacles, trying to process what he was seeing.
Gold discoveries weren't uncommon in Arizona territory, but a nugget of this size would be worth far more than Margaret's debt. "Sir," Polk stammered, his auctioneer's confidence evaporating like morning dew, "I need to verify the authenticity and value of your payment method." Running Bear stepped closer to the platform, his warriors forming a loose semicircle behind him. The townspeople instinctively backed away, creating a wider circle around the auction block. The Apache leader's voice carried clearly across the silent square. "This gold came from the sacred mountains of my people. It has been passed down through 7 generations of my family. My great-grandfather carried it during the long walk. My grandfather held it when the soldiers came. My father clutched it during the treaty negotiations." He paused, his dark eyes never leaving Polk's face. "Today, I give it for the freedom of one who showed mercy to my daughter." Dr. Webb pushed forward through the crowd, his medical bag still in his hand from morning rounds. His face was pale with understanding. "Joseph, you don't need to do this. Margaret helped Little Hawk because it was right, not because she expected payment." Running Bear turned to face the doctor who had saved his daughter's life. "You speak the truth, medicine man. But my people understand debts that go beyond money. This woman's spirit is like the wild horses that refuse the rope. To keep such a spirit caged is to kill it slowly. I will not allow this death while I have breath." Margaret stared at the Apache warrior, her mind reeling. The golden nugget represented more than money. It was family history, cultural heritage, generations of survival and resistance. And he was willing to trade it all for her freedom from a debt she'd never asked to carry. "I can't accept this," she said, her Irish accent thick with emotion. "That gold belongs to your family, your people. I'm nobody special, just an immigrant trying to find her way." Running Bear's weathered face softened slightly. "Little Hawk is alive because of your hands, your songs, your heart. You are already family to us. Family protects family." Sheriff Bradley finally found his voice, though it came out as more of a croak. "Now, hold on here. This is highly irregular. We need to establish the legal precedent for this type of transaction, and we need to verify the gold's value." Judge Harrison Blackwood had been watching from the courthouse steps, initially drawn by curiosity, but now recognizing the historical significance of what was unfolding. As the territorial judge, he'd presided over countless property disputes, contract negotiations, and legal proceedings. But this situation was unlike anything in his experience. Blackwood descended the courthouse steps slowly, his black robes billowing in the desert breeze. The crowd parted respectfully as he approached. At 63, he'd seen the territory transform from lawless frontier to organized society, had witnessed the Apache Wars and the eventual peace treaty. His decisions often shaped the future of the region. "Mr. Polk," said Judge Blackwood formally, "suspend the auction proceedings. We need to address several legal questions before continuing." He turned to Running Bear. "Sir, I recognize your right to participate in this auction, but we must verify the authenticity and value of your payment method." Running Bear nodded solemnly. "I understand your laws require proof. But know this, Judge. The value of this gold cannot be measured only in your dollars. It carries the prayers of my ancestors, the tears of my children, the hopes of my people."
From the crowd, a new voice emerged. Amanda Richardson, the territory's only licensed assayer, stepped forward. A woman of 45 who'd learned her trade from her deceased husband, she'd built a reputation for absolute honesty in her assessments. Miners, ranchers, and traders trusted her judgment implicitly. "Your Honor," Amanda said, removing a small magnifying loupe from her jacket pocket, "I can provide a preliminary assessment right here, with a full assay completed within the hour if needed." Judge Blackwood considered this. "Very well, Mrs. Richardson. Please proceed with your examination." The crowd pressed closer as Amanda approached Running Bear. He handed her the golden nugget without hesitation, their fingers touching briefly in the transfer. Amanda held the gold up to the sunlight, examining its color, weight, and texture with practiced eyes. The nugget was roughly egg-shaped, but irregular, with natural formations that spoke of its origin in mountain streams rather than artificial smelting. Its color was deep and rich, the kind of gold that experienced miners dreamed about finding. Amanda tested its weight in her palm, then examined it through her loupe. "Preliminary assessment," she announced to the waiting crowd, "indicates this is natural placer gold of exceptional purity. Based on weight and quality, I estimate its value at approximately $800 to $1,000. A collective gasp rose from the crowd. $1,000 was more than most people saw in 5 years of hard work. It was enough to buy a substantial ranch, start a business, or live comfortably for a decade. And Running Bear was offering it for the freedom of an Irish immigrant with a $375 debt. Polk wiped his forehead again, his handkerchief now soaked with perspiration. "Sir, if this assessment is accurate, your payment would exceed the required debt by a considerable margin. Typically, the excess would be returned to you, minus auction fees and administrative costs." Running Bear shook his head slowly. "Keep it all. Use what remains to help others like her, people trapped by debts they cannot escape. People whose spirits are being crushed by systems they did not choose." Margaret felt tears streaming down her cheeks. The magnitude of the gesture overwhelmed her. This man, this warrior from a culture she barely understood, was sacrificing his family's most precious possession to free her from bondage. But more than that, he was using the remainder to help others in similar situations. "Why?" she whispered, though in the absolute silence of the square everyone heard her question. Running Bear looked directly at her, his eyes reflecting decades of wisdom and pain. "When my people were forced from our lands, we learned that freedom is not something to be bought or sold. It is a gift from the Creator, meant for all His children. The whites have forgotten this truth, created laws that make some people property of others. But the Creator's law is higher than man's law." Father Santos crossed himself and stepped forward. "Joseph speaks wisdom that echoes our Lord's teachings. The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because He has anointed me to proclaim good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim liberty to the captives and recovery of sight to the blind, to set at liberty those who are oppressed." Carlos Mendoza found himself nodding in agreement. He'd seen enough suffering caused by the indenture system, had watched too many immigrants broken by debts they could never realistically pay. If an Apache warrior could understand justice better than the territorial government, perhaps it was time to question the system itself. Dr. Webb looked between his former household servant and the Apache leader who'd become an unlikely ally. "Margaret, if you accept this gift, what will you do? Where will you go?" Margaret wiped her eyes with the back of her bound hands, trying to compose herself. "I don't know. I came west looking for opportunity, for the chance to build something of my own. Maybe I can find work that pays real wages, save enough to help others like Joseph suggests. Maybe I can become the kind of person who deserves such generosity." Eleanor Webb, who had been silently watching from beside her husband, suddenly stepped forward. "Margaret, we have a proposition. We've been thinking about opening a clinic for the poorest families in the territory, people who can't afford medical care. We need someone with your skills and compassion to help run it. The pay would be modest, but it would be honest wages for meaningful work."
Running Bear smiled for the first time since approaching the platform. The medicine man and his woman have wise hearts. Such work would honor the gift you've been given. Judge Blackwood cleared his throat, calling attention back to the legal proceedings. We still have formalities to complete. Mrs. Richardson, please prepare a full written assay of the gold. Mr. Polk, prepare the necessary documentation for the debt transfer. Sheriff Bradley, please release Miss Sullivan from her bonds. As of this moment, her indenture contract is satisfied. As Sheriff Bradley cut the ropes binding Margaret's wrists, she rubbed circulation back into her hands and looked around at the faces surrounding her. Some showed curiosity, others confusion, a few revealed hostility at the precedent being set. But many reflected something she hadn't seen much of in Arizona territory: genuine human compassion. The crowd began to disperse slowly, people gathering in small groups to discuss what they'd witnessed. The story would be told and retold throughout the territory, growing with each telling, becoming legend before the sun set.
But near the platform, a smaller group remained. Running Bear's warriors, the Webb family, Father Santos, Carlos Mendoza, and Amanda Richardson formed an unlikely circle around Margaret and the Apache leader. There's something else, Amanda said quietly, still holding the golden nugget. This particular formation, these specific mineral inclusions, I've seen similar patterns before. This gold came from the Superstition Mountains, didn't it? Running Bear's expression became guarded. You have skilled eyes, Gold Woman. The superstitions are sacred to your people, Amanda continued respectfully. Legend says the mountains hold vast gold deposits, but your bands have always protected them from white prospectors. For you to carry gold from there means some gifts are too important to keep hidden, Running Bear interrupted gently. When the Creator places gold in the earth, he does so for purposes beyond human understanding. Today, this gold served its intended purpose. Dr. Webb realized the full magnitude of what had occurred. Joseph, you've not only freed Margaret, you've challenged the entire indenture system. Other immigrants, other people trapped by impossible debts, they'll hear about today. You've started something that can't be stopped. Running Bear nodded gravely. Change comes like the seasons, slowly at first, then all at once. Perhaps today, I planted seeds that will grow into a more just harvest. Margaret looked at each face in the circle, memorizing this moment when her life had been transformed by the unexpected kindness of strangers who'd become family. I don't have enough words to express my gratitude, but I promise you this: I'll spend the rest of my life trying to be worthy of what happened here today. You already are, Running Bear said simply. Now, let us speak of practical matters. You will need a place to stay while you decide your future. My band camps 3 miles north of town. You are welcome at our fires until you find your path. Eleanor Webb shook her head. Margaret should stay with us. We have preparations to make for the clinic, and she'll need time to recover her strength and plan her next steps. As the group continued making plans, Amanda Richardson examined the gold nugget one final time before placing it in her secure pouch for the formal assay. Something nagged at her about the mineral formations, but she couldn't quite identify what it was. She made a mental note to research the geological surveys of the Superstition Mountains when she returned to her office. The sun had climbed past its zenith, casting shorter shadows across the courthouse square. What had begun as a routine auction of a labor contract had transformed into something unprecedented in territorial history, a moment when 2 cultures had found common ground in the simple recognition of human dignity. But in the growing shadows, other eyes had been watching, other minds calculating. Word of the Apache gold would spread beyond Tombstone, reaching people whose interests lay not in justice, but in profit. The location of Running Bear's treasure would become a question that would haunt the territory for years to come. And in the offices of the Brennan Trading Company in Phoenix, men were already planning their response to this challenge to their profitable indenture system.
Margaret Sullivan's freedom had been purchased, but the war for justice was just beginning. 3 days after the auction, news of Margaret Sullivan's freedom had spread across Arizona territory like wildfire through dry grass. Telegraph lines carried the story to distant towns, stagecoach drivers repeated it at every stop, and newspaper editors from Tucson to Phoenix scrambled to gather details about the unprecedented event. In the luxurious offices of Brennan Trading Company in Phoenix, company president William Brennan III crushed his morning cigar between his teeth as he read the Tombstone Telegraph. His grandfather had built the trading empire on simple principles: identify desperate people, provide them with just enough hope to accept unfavorable terms, then profit from their desperation for years to come. The indenture system had been particularly lucrative. Irish immigrants fleeing poverty, German families seeking new starts, Chinese workers building railroads, all needed passage money, supplies, or work arrangements that the company generously provided at interest rates that ensured long-term profits. Margaret Sullivan alone had generated over $600 in fees and interest during her 8 months in the system. Mr. Brennan, his secretary Nathan Pierce, entered the office carrying a stack of morning correspondence. We've received inquiries from 3 newspapers requesting interviews about the Sullivan case. The Phoenix Herald wants to know if we plan to contest the transaction. Brennan stood and walked to his office window, gazing down on the busy Phoenix streets where his wealth was clearly visible in the form of company buildings, warehouses, and freight yards. At 48, he'd inherited a successful business and expanded it into a territorial monopoly. He wasn't about to let one Apache warrior's gesture of charity threaten his empire. "Wire our attorney in Tombstone," Brennan said without turning from the window. "Have him research whether the transaction was conducted according to territorial law. Find any technicality, any procedural error that might invalidate it. And send word to our contacts at the territorial capital. I want to know what Governor Morrison thinks about Apache interference in legitimate business contracts." Meanwhile, in the newly established Webb Clinic on the outskirts of Tombstone, Margaret Sullivan was learning that freedom brought its own challenges. She'd spent 3 days helping Eleanor Webb inventory medical supplies and prepare the small building that would serve their poorest patients, but her mind kept returning to the weight of Running Bear's sacrifice.
"You're troubled," Dr. Webb observed, as Margaret organized bandages with unnecessary precision. "Having second thoughts about accepting Joseph's gift?" Margaret paused in her work, her hand still among the white cotton strips. "Not second thoughts exactly, but I keep thinking about that gold, about what it meant to his family. 7 generations of his ancestors carried it through wars, forced relocations, treaty negotiations, and I'm just nobody, a failed immigrant with a debt I couldn't pay." Eleanor Webb looked up from her pharmaceutical ledger. "Margaret, you're viewing this backwards. Joseph didn't give that gold for who you are. He gave it for who you might become. The question isn't whether you deserved it yesterday, but whether you'll honor it tomorrow." Through the clinic's single window, they could see dust clouds on the horizon where Running Bear's band maintained their temporary camp. The Apache leader had kept his word about offering Margaret shelter, though she'd chosen to stay with the Webbs instead. Still, members of his band visited daily, bringing herbs for the clinic's medicine chest and sharing knowledge of desert healing practices. That afternoon, Amanda Richardson arrived at the clinic carrying her completed assay report and wearing an expression of barely contained excitement. The territorial assayer had spent 3 days conducting the most thorough analysis of her career, and her findings went beyond simple gold evaluation. "Margaret, Dr. Webb," Amanda said breathlessly, "I need to show you something extraordinary about that gold nugget. May I use your table?" She spread detailed geological charts across the clinic's examining table, weighted down by rock samples and measurement instruments. Her finger traced mineral veins through cross-sectional diagrams of the Superstition Mountains. "The gold Joseph used to purchase Margaret's freedom isn't just valuable because of its purity. The specific mineral inclusions, the crystalline structures, the trace elements, they tell a story about geological formations that could revolutionize our understanding of Arizona's mineral wealth."
Dr. Webb studied the charts with growing concern. "Amanda, what exactly are you saying?" "I'm saying that the location where this gold originated contains deposits that could be worth millions of dollars. The geological signatures are unlike anything I've seen in 20 years of assaying. If word of this gets out, every prospector, mining company, and treasure hunter in the Southwest will descend on Apache territory." Margaret felt a chill that had nothing to do with the desert evening. "Joseph said that gold came from sacred mountains. If people start digging there—" "It would violate the treaty," Dr. Webb finished grimly. "The Superstition Mountains are specifically protected under the peace agreement. Any mining activity there would be considered an act of aggression against the Apache bands." Amanda carefully rolled up her geological charts. "I've been debating what to do with this information. As a licensed territorial assayer, I'm required to report significant mineral discoveries to the Territorial Mining Commission. But reporting this could destroy the peace that's taken years to build." The three women sat in contemplative silence as the sun set over the Arizona desert, each understanding that Amanda's discovery had placed them at the center of a potential crisis. The gold that had purchased Margaret's freedom might now threaten the freedom of Running Bear's entire people. Their contemplation was interrupted by the arrival of Carlos Mendoza, whose horse bore the dust of hard riding. The vaquero dismounted quickly and approached the clinic with obvious urgency. "Señoras, doctor, I bring you a warning from my ranch. This afternoon, strangers arrived asking questions about the Apache gold. Professional men, well-dressed, carrying surveying equipment. They claimed to be conducting geological research for the territorial government." Eleanor Webb invited Carlos inside while Margaret prepared coffee. The vaquero's weathered hands showed his nervousness as he described the afternoon's events. "These men were not scientists. I've seen enough mining speculators to recognize the type. They asked detailed questions about the auction, about the Apache camp's location, about local geology. When I told them nothing, they offered me $50 for information about paths into the Superstition Mountains." Dr. Webb and Amanda exchanged worried glances. If professional prospectors were already mobilizing, word of the gold's origin had traveled farther and faster than they'd feared. "Did you recognize any of these men?" asked Amanda. Carlos nodded grimly. The leader introduced himself as Marcus Webb. "No relation to you, doctor. But I've heard that name before. He works for the Brennan Trading Company as what they call a resource acquisition specialist. In Mexico, we had a different name for such men." Margaret set down her coffee cup with enough force to rattle the saucer. "So William Brennan is already moving to profit from Joseph's sacrifice. First, he trapped me in debt bondage. Now he wants to steal Apache gold." "It's worse than simple theft," said Dr. Webb quietly. "If Brennan's people start mining in the superstitions, it will trigger a war. The Apache bands will have no choice but to defend their sacred lands. The territorial government will send troops to protect legal mining operations, and we'll return to the bloodshed we've spent years trying to end."
Amanda stood and began pacing the small clinic. "I could file a false report, claim the gold was of inferior quality or of unknown origin. That might discourage immediate interest." "No," Margaret said firmly, surprising everyone with the steel in her voice. "Lies will only delay the inevitable. When the truth comes out, and it always does, your reputation will be destroyed and the Apache will face even worse consequences for hiding valuable resources." Eleanor Webb watched Margaret with growing admiration. The young Irish immigrant was displaying leadership qualities that 3 days of freedom had somehow unlocked. "What do you suggest?" Margaret walked to the window and looked toward the distant Apache camp, where evening fires cast warm glows against the darkening sky. "We warn Joseph immediately. Give him and his people time to prepare for what's coming, and then we stand with them when it arrives." Carlos nodded approvingly. "The señorita speaks wisdom. Running Bear saved her from bondage. Now perhaps she can help save his people from a different kind of slavery." As if summoned by their conversation, hoofbeats approached the clinic. Through the window, they could see Running Bear himself riding toward them, accompanied by 2 of his warriors.
Even in the fading light, his urgency was unmistakable. Running Bear dismounted and approached the clinic with the fluid grace that marked his people's movements, but Margaret noticed tension in his shoulders, a wariness in his eyes that hadn't been present during the auction. "Medicine man, brave women, I come with troubling news. My scouts report strangers near the sacred mountains, men with metal tools who dig in the earth and mark trees with symbols. They move like wolves hunting prey." "We've heard similar reports," Dr. Webb replied, gesturing for Running Bear to enter the clinic. "It seems your generous act at the auction has attracted unwanted attention." Running Bear accepted Eleanor's offer of coffee, but remained standing, his warrior's instincts keeping him alert for immediate departure if necessary. "The elders of my band are divided. Some say we should move deeper into the mountains, away from the white men's greed. Others believe we must defend our treaty rights through your courts and laws." Margaret stood to face the Apache leader directly. "Joseph, I need to tell you something about the gold you used to free me. Amanda's analysis revealed information that changes everything." She explained Amanda's geological findings as simply as possible, watching Running Bear's expression shift from confusion to understanding to grim acceptance. When she finished, the Apache warrior was quiet for a long moment. "So the gift I gave to free one captive may enslave my entire people. The Creator's humor is sometimes hard to understand." "There might be another way," Amanda said suddenly, her assayer's mind working through possibilities. "The territorial mining laws require specific procedures for filing claims on valuable deposits. If those procedures aren't followed exactly, claims can be invalidated. And there are environmental protections for culturally significant sites." "You speak of fighting them with their own laws," Running Bear observed. "This could work, but it would require allies among your people, friends willing to stand against powerful enemies." Margaret looked around the room at the faces of people who had become her unlikely family, the doctor who had shown her kindness, his wife who had offered her meaningful work, the assayer who had risked her professional reputation, the vaquero who had ridden hard to bring warning, and the Apache warrior who had sacrificed his family's treasure for her freedom. "You already have those allies," she said quietly. "The question is whether we're brave enough to use the weapons we have: knowledge, law, friendship, and the truth about what's right and wrong." Running Bear studied Margaret's face in the lamplight, seeing something there that reminded him of the determination his daughter had shown fighting the rattlesnake's poison. "Irish woman who sings to sick children," he said, using the name his people had given her. "You speak like a war chief planning battle. Are you prepared for the kind of war this will be?" Margaret thought of the workhouses in Ireland, the ship's hold during the Atlantic crossing, the months of bondage in Arizona territory, and the moment when Running Bear's gold had transformed her from property back into a human being. She thought of Little Hawk's fevered face and the songs that had helped heal a frightened child. "I've been fighting wars my whole life," she said simply, "but this is the first time I've had allies worth fighting alongside." Outside the clinic, the desert night settled over Arizona territory with deceptive peace. But in Phoenix, telegrams were being sent to mining companies across the Southwest. In Tombstone, surveying teams were studying maps by candlelight. And in the Superstition Mountains, ancient spirits watched as the sacred ground prepared for yet another test of whether justice to triumph over greed. 1 week after Amanda Richardson's devastating revelation about the gold deposits, Tombstone had transformed from a sleepy territorial town into a bustling hub of activity. Hotels overflowed with newly arrived prospectors, surveyors, and mining company representatives. The dusty streets echoed with the sounds of wagon wheels, pack mules, and heated negotiations conducted in saloon corners.
At the Occidental Hotel, the most expensive establishment in town, Marcus Webb occupied the finest suite while coordinating Brennan Trading Company's response to what they'd privately begun calling the Apache opportunity. Webb was a man who understood that fortunes were built not just on finding valuable resources, but on acquiring them through any means necessary. "Gentlemen," Webb addressed his assembled team of specialists, spreading territorial maps across the suite's mahogany table, "our geological surveys confirm what the Richardson woman discovered. The Superstition Mountain deposits could yield more gold than the California strikes of '49, but we're operating under significant legal constraints. James Crawford, Brennan's chief legal counsel, adjusted his wire-rimmed spectacles as he reviewed thick folders of territorial law. The treaty protections are ironclad regarding sacred Apache sites. However, if we can prove the Apache are using the gold for commercial purposes rather than religious ones, we might argue that the commercial mining clause supersedes cultural protections. Samuel Morrison, no relation to the territorial governor despite sharing a surname, served as Brennan's negotiation specialist, a euphemism for a man skilled at making problems disappear through intimidation or bribery. We could approach individual Apache leaders, offer them personal wealth in exchange for mining rights, divide their unity, create internal conflicts. Webb nodded approvingly. Multi-pronged approach. Crawford handles legal challenges to the treaty, Morrison works on fragmenting Apache resistance, while I coordinate our geological teams. But remember, speed is essential. Other mining companies have caught wind of this discovery. Colorado Mining Syndicate already has teams en route. Meanwhile, at Running Bear's camp north of Tombstone, an extraordinary council meeting was taking place. Representatives from 3 Apache bands had gathered to discuss the mining threat, joined by unexpected allies from the white community. Margaret Sullivan sat beside Little Hawk, the child whose recovery had sparked this entire crisis, while Dr. Webb, Amanda Richardson, and Carlos Mendoza formed part of the circle. Chief Gray Wolf, leader of the largest Apache band in the region, spoke with the gravity of a man who'd witnessed decades of broken promises. The white men's hunger for gold has brought armies before. Each time they promised this would be the last violation of our lands. Each time they lied. Running Bear's brother, Stone Eagle, was more militant in his views. The treaty means nothing to them when they smell profit. We should drive them from our mountains now before they bring soldiers to protect their digging. But Running Bear himself counseled patience. Hasty action will give them excuse to call us treaty breakers. If we strike first, we justify their claims that we are savages who cannot be trusted with valuable land. Margaret listened carefully to the debate, her understanding of Apache growing stronger daily through immersion in their community. Little Hawk had become her informal teacher, patiently correcting pronunciation and explaining cultural nuances that formal lessons couldn't convey. The Irish faced similar choices, Margaret said when invited to speak. When the English took our lands for their plantations, some fought with guns and paid with their lives. Others fought with laws and papers, often failing, but sometimes winning small victories that built into larger changes. The most successful resistance combined both approaches, never surrendering the right to defend ourselves, but choosing when and how to fight. Amanda Richardson had spent days studying territorial mining laws, searching for legal protections that might stop the impending invasion. There's a provision in the Territorial Code requiring environmental impact assessments for mining operations near water sources. The superstitions feed several streams that supply water to Apache communities and white settlements alike. If we can prove mining would threaten water quality. Dr. Webb nodded thoughtfully. Medical documentation of water contamination could provide grounds for injunctions. I could coordinate with territorial health officials, document potential public health risks. Chief Gray Wolf studied these white allies with cautious hope. You speak of using their laws against them, but what happens when their courts rule against us? What happens when their lawyers find ways around every protection? The question hung in the desert air like smoke from the council fire. Everyone understood that legal resistance might only delay the inevitable confrontation. That evening, as the council dispersed and families returned to their traditional activities, Margaret found herself walking with Little Hawk along the creek that bordered the camp. The 12-year-old girl moved with the quiet confidence of someone raised in harmony with the desert landscape. "Irish sister," Little Hawk said in carefully practiced English, "my father's heart is heavy with worry. The gold he gave for your freedom has brought danger to our people." Margaret knelt beside the creek, watching moonlight dance on the flowing water. "Your father saved my life in more ways than just buying my freedom. But now, I need to find a way to protect his family the way he protected me." "There are stories," Little Hawk said quietly, "about the gold in our sacred mountains. My grandmother told me these stories, made me promise never to share them with white people.
Margaret felt the weight of the child's trust. If sharing those stories might help protect your people, maybe your grandmother would understand. Little Hawk considered this seriously. She said the gold in the mountains is not like other gold. It grows from the tears of earth spirits who weep for harmony between all peoples. To take it without permission brings curse, not on the gold itself, but on the hearts of those who steal it. What kind of curse? Endless hunger that can never be satisfied. The more they take, the more they need. They become like desert spirits who feed on fear and anger, never finding peace. Margaret studied the child's solemn face. Little Hawk, do you believe these stories are literally true? Or are they teaching stories about the consequences of greed? Both, Little Hawk replied without hesitation. Truth has many layers, like the rocks in the canyon walls. The spirits are real, but so are the lessons about what happens when people forget respect for the earth and each other. Their conversation was interrupted by approaching hoofbeats. Carlos Mendoza rode into the camp with obvious urgency, his horse lathered from hard riding. "Margaret, Little Hawk," Carlos called out, quickly dismounting. "Where is Running Bear? I bring news that cannot wait." Running Bear emerged from his family's wickiup within moments, his warrior instincts immediately alert to Carlos's distress. "Friend Carlos, what brings you to our fires with such speed?" Carlos accepted water gratefully before speaking. "This afternoon, I encountered a territorial survey team marking trees in the foothills below the superstitions. When I questioned their authority, they produced official documents signed by Governor Morrison himself, authorizing geological surveys for territorial development purposes." Running Bear's expression darkened. "The governor has no authority to authorize surveys on treaty-protected land without tribal consent." "That's what I told them," Carlos continued. "But their leader, a man named Patterson, said the treaty provisions only applied to active religious sites. He claimed the gold deposits were in areas not currently used for ceremonies, making them available for territorial development." Margaret felt anger rising in her chest. They're reinterpreting the treaty to suit their purposes, finding loopholes to justify breaking promises. Running Bear called for Stone Eagle and the other war leaders. Within minutes, the camp's most experienced fighters had gathered around Carlos's horse, their faces grim in the firelight. "How many men in this survey team?" Stone Eagle asked. 12 that I saw," Carlos replied, but Patterson mentioned additional teams arriving within days, and he spoke of military escorts for the mining operations themselves. Stone Eagle's hand moved instinctively to his rifle. Military escorts mean they expect resistance. They're preparing for war while talking of legal surveys. Running Bear held up a hand for patience. "We must move carefully." "Carlos, did these men know you observed them?" "I made no secret of my presence. Told them I was checking cattle for my patron, which is true enough. But Patterson seemed very interested in my connection to the Apache bands, asked pointed questions about your camp's location and numbers." Dr. Webb, who had approached during the conversation, spoke up with medical authority. "If they're bringing military escorts, we need to document everything legally before any violence occurs. I'll wire colleagues in Phoenix and Tucson, ensure there are witnesses to whatever happens next." Margaret stood and faced the circle of worried faces. Apache warriors, a Mexican vaquero, an Anglo doctor, all united by their recognition that justice was about to be tested by greed. "We need to split our efforts," she said, her voice carrying the conviction of someone who'd found her calling. "Some of us work within their legal system, filing challenges and demanding proper procedures. Others document every treaty violation, every illegal survey, every threat made against Apache peoples. And if their system fails us completely," she looked directly at Stone Eagle, "then we make sure the world knows exactly why the Apache chose to defend their sacred land." Running Bear studied Margaret with growing respect. The frightened immigrant he'd freed at auction had transformed into a strategic thinker who understood both the moral and practical dimensions of their struggle.
Irish woman who sings to sick children speaks wisdom, he said formally. We will prepare for all possibilities, the path of laws and papers, and the path of rifles and courage. Amanda Richardson, who had been quietly calculating throughout the discussion, finally spoke. There's something else we need to consider. The geological formations in the superstitions are unstable. Heavy mining operations could trigger landslides, flash floods, even earthquakes. If we can prove the environmental dangers to whom? Stone Eagle asked pointedly. If their mining kills Apache people, they call it progress. If it threatens white settlements, they call it a catastrophe requiring immediate action. The harsh truth of his observation settled over the group like desert dust. They were fighting not just for Apache rights, but against a system that valued white lives and profits above indigenous survival. Carlos gathered his reins, preparing for the ride back to his ranch. I'll keep watching the survey teams, report their movements. But friends, we may have less time than we hoped. Patterson mentioned something about fast-tracking the development timeline due to pressure from competitors. As Carlos rode away into the night, the remaining allies sat in contemplative silence. They'd moved from hoping to prevent the mining threat to preparing for an almost inevitable confrontation. The gold that had purchased Margaret's freedom was about to demand a much higher price from everyone involved. Little Hawk, who had listened quietly to the adult conversations, finally spoke in Apache to her father. Running Bear nodded gravely and translated for the group. My daughter reminds us of an important truth. She says that when her grandmother told stories about the cursed gold, she always ended with the same words. The earth remembers those who show respect, and the earth remembers those who show greed. In the end, the earth decides who deserves its gifts. Margaret looked up at the star-filled sky above the Arizona desert, wondering if the earth was already making its decision about the forces now converging on the Superstition Mountains. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new threats, and new tests of the unlikely alliance that had formed around Running Bear's act of generosity. But tonight, beside a peaceful creek with friends who'd become family, she felt something she'd never experienced during her months of bondage, the strength that comes from standing with others for something larger than personal survival. The territorial courthouse in Phoenix had never hosted a more unusual gathering. Judge Blackwood had traveled from Tombstone at the urgent request of territorial officials, finding himself presiding over an emergency hearing that would determine whether mining operations could proceed in the Superstition Mountains. The ornate courtroom, built to impress visitors with territorial authority, now buzzed with tension between opposing forces. On one side sat the mining interests, Marcus Webb representing Brennan Trading Company, legal counsel James Crawford, Territorial Mining Commissioner Frederick Hayes, and surprisingly, Governor Morrison himself. Their tables groaned under geological surveys, property assessments, and legal briefs arguing for immediate development rights. Across the aisle, an unprecedented coalition had assembled. Running Bear sat beside Margaret Sullivan, both represented by Territorial Attorney Daniel McKenna, who'd taken their case without payment after hearing their story. Dr. Webb served as their medical expert witness, while Amanda Richardson clutched her geological findings like a shield against corporate greed. Judge Blackwood called for order as spectators packed every available seat. Newspaper reporters from across the Southwest scribbled notes, understanding they were witnessing a legal battle that would reshape territorial policy for decades. This emergency hearing, Judge Blackwood announced formally, will determine whether territorial mining permits can supersede federal treaty obligations regarding Apache sacred sites. Given the complexity of jurisdictions involved, I've requested federal oversight. Territorial Governor Morrison will present the development case first. Governor Morrison rose slowly, his silver hair gleaming under the courtroom chandeliers. At 61, he'd built his political career on promoting Arizona's economic development, often at the expense of indigenous rights. Today's hearing represented either his greatest triumph or his most damaging failure.
McKenna rose for cross-examination, his questions sharp and precise. Mr. Crawford, how does territorial law define active religious sites? Are Christian churches only protected when services are occurring, or do they maintain sacred status continuously? The comparison isn't equivalent, Crawford replied smoothly. Apache religious practices differ significantly from Christian traditions. Their ceremonies move between various locations rather than focusing on permanent structures. So, Apache religious practices receive less legal protection because they differ from Christian customs? Crawford's hesitation was brief, but telling. The law requires specific, documented usage patterns. Vague claims about spiritual connection to vast landscapes cannot supersede territorial development rights. Judge Blackwood intervened before McKenna could respond. Mr. Crawford, the federal treaty doesn't require Apache religious practices to conform to Christian models for legal protection. Please restrict your arguments to actual legal precedents. The morning session continued with testimony from territorial mining experts, economic development specialists, and geological surveyors. Each witness painted mining development as inevitable progress that would benefit all territorial residents. But Margaret noticed they never addressed the question of consent, whether Apache communities actually wanted this imposed prosperity. During the lunch recess, the Apache coalition gathered in a small conference room adjacent to the courthouse. Running Bear had remained silent throughout the morning testimony, but his weathered features reflected deep contemplation. Their arguments sound reasonable to people who don't understand what they're really proposing, Margaret observed, sharing sandwiches Eleanor Webb had prepared for the group. They're making treaty violations sound like economic opportunities. Dr. Webb studied his notes from the morning session. They're being careful to avoid overtly racist language, but the underlying assumption is clear. Apache rights are negotiable when they conflict with territorial profits. McKenna was reviewing his afternoon strategy when a knock interrupted their discussion. Sheriff Bradley entered with obvious reluctance, accompanied by a man none of them recognized. "Folks," Bradley said uncomfortably, "this is Federal Marshal Thomas Anderson. He needs to speak with Running Bear immediately." Marshal Anderson was a tall, lean man whose weathered face suggested years of difficult assignments across the frontier territories. He carried himself with the quiet authority of someone accustomed to dealing with volatile situations. "Mr. Running Bear," Anderson said respectfully, "I've been sent by the Bureau of Indian Affairs to inform you that federal officials are concerned about potential violence arising from the mining dispute. I'm authorized to offer your band relocation to alternative lands if you feel threatened by development activities." Running Bear studied the federal marshal carefully. "You offer us the choice between abandoning our sacred mountains or watching them be destroyed by mining companies. This is the same choice your government has offered my people for generations: surrender or be crushed." "I'm not here to make threats," Anderson replied calmly. "I'm here to prevent bloodshed. If mining operations proceed and your people resist, federal troops will be called to maintain order. I've seen how such confrontations end. I'm trying to offer you alternatives." Margaret stood up abruptly, her Irish temper flaring. "Marshal Anderson, what alternatives are you offering the mining companies? Are you suggesting they relocate their greed to alternative mountains?" Anderson turned to study Margaret with professional interest. "You're the woman whose freedom caused this entire situation. Some people are saying that one Apache's generosity has created a crisis that could destabilize the entire territory." "Some people," Margaret replied icily, "seem to think that Apache generosity is more dangerous than corporate theft." McKenna intervened before the confrontation could escalate.
Mr. Anderson, we appreciate the federal concern for peaceful resolution, but the proper federal response would be enforcing existing treaty obligations, not offering to relocate the victims of treaty violations. The afternoon session brought a dramatic shift in courtroom dynamics. McKenna called Running Bear as his first witness, and the Apache leader's testimony commanded attention through its quiet dignity rather than emotional appeals. "Your Honor," Running Bear said, speaking directly to Judge Blackwood, "when my people signed the treaty, we believed white law would protect our sacred places the same way it protects white churches and cemeteries. We were told that putting agreements on paper would make them permanent and honored." Judge Blackwood leaned forward slightly. "Mr. Running Bear, do you understand the territorial arguments about economic development benefiting all residents, including Apache communities?" Running Bear replied, "I understand that every time white men find something valuable on Apache land, they discover reasons why their law no longer applies to our agreements. The gold I gave for Irish women's freedom came from 7 generations of my family's protection. If territorial law can take it because they call our protection inactive, then no Apache possession is safe from white hunger."
McKenna continued his examination carefully. "Mr. Running Bear, can you explain to the court how Apache religious practices relate to the landscape itself, rather than specific ceremony locations?" Running Bear spoke for nearly an hour about Apache spiritual beliefs, describing how their entire cosmology was anchored in specific geographic features, seasonal migration patterns, and ancestral burial sites scattered throughout the superstitions. His testimony was simultaneously educational and deeply moving, painting a picture of religious practice inseparable from the land itself. Crawford's cross-examination focused on technical legal definitions, attempting to force Running Bear's spiritual explanations into narrow categories that territorial law could dismiss. But the Apache leader refused to be trapped by artificial distinctions between sacred and secular land usage. "You ask me to separate the sacred from the ordinary," Running Bear told Crawford. "This is like asking a white man to separate his soul from his body. The connection exists or it doesn't. It cannot be divided by surveyor's lines or legal definitions." Dr. Webb's testimony focused on environmental health risks, documenting how mining operations near water sources could contaminate supplies for both Apache communities and white settlements downstream. His medical authority lent credibility to concerns about public health impacts that transcended racial boundaries. Amanda Richardson's geological testimony proved most damaging to the mining company's case. Her detailed analysis revealed that the Superstition Mountain deposits were located in extremely unstable geological formations, where heavy mining equipment could trigger catastrophic landslides. "Your Honor," Amanda explained, pointing to cross-sectional diagrams, "these gold deposits exist within fault zones that have remained stable only because they haven't been disturbed. Large-scale mining operations would almost certainly trigger seismic activity that could affect settlements within a 50-mile radius." Crawford attempted to discredit Amanda's findings by questioning her qualifications and suggesting she was biased by personal relationships with the Apache Coalition. But Amanda's scientific credentials were impeccable, and her geological analysis was supported by territorial survey data that the mining companies themselves had submitted. The final witness of the day created the biggest sensation. Margaret Sullivan took the witness stand wearing a simple blue dress Eleanor Webb had made for her, her red hair braided in the Irish style her mother had taught her years ago. She looked directly at Judge Blackwood as she was sworn in. "Ms. Sullivan," McKenna began gently, "please tell the court how you came to be involved in this dispute." Margaret's testimony began with her arrival in Arizona Territory as an indentured immigrant, her struggles within the bondage system, and her multiple escape attempts. She described Running Bear's unprecedented act of generosity at the auction, using family gold to purchase her freedom. "Your Honor," Margaret said, her voice gaining strength as she spoke, "I came to America seeking the freedom that this country promises to all people.
Instead, I found a legal system that made property to be bought and sold. Running Bear freed me from that bondage, asking nothing in return except that I use my freedom wisely." She paused, looking across the courtroom at the faces of mining company representatives, territorial officials, and newspaper reporters. Now those same people who profited from my bondage want to use Running Bear's generous gold as justification for stealing Apache sacred lands. They're turning his gift of freedom into their excuse for imposing new forms of slavery on his people. Crawford objected that Margaret's testimony was argumentative rather than factual, but Judge Blackwood allowed her to continue. "The question before this court isn't whether mining would be profitable or whether Apache religious practices fit white legal definitions. The question is whether America will honor its promises to people who trusted those promises, or whether justice depends on the color of your skin and the size of your bank account." As court adjourned for the day, spectators filed out in subdued discussion. Margaret's testimony had reframed the entire dispute, connecting Apache treaty rights to broader questions about American justice and equality. But outside the courthouse, Marshal Anderson was deep in conversation with territorial officials. Federal troops were already en route to Arizona territory, ostensibly to maintain peace during the mining development. The legal battle was ending, but the real confrontation was just beginning. Judge Blackwood had not slept well since the courthouse hearing. His chambers in the Phoenix courthouse felt suffocating as he reviewed legal precedents late into the night, searching for wisdom that might prevent the brewing catastrophe. At dawn, on the day he would deliver his ruling, he stood at his office window watching federal troops establish camp on the outskirts of town. The soldiers had arrived under cover of darkness, 2 companies of cavalry under Major Robert Caldwell, a career officer who'd spent 15 years fighting Apache warriors before the peace treaty transformed enemies into uneasy neighbors. Caldwell understood better than most politicians that the current crisis could shatter years of delicate diplomatic progress.
In the military encampment, Major Caldwell reviewed his orders with growing unease. The War Department's instructions seemed deliberately vague. Maintain territorial security during mining development operations while respecting existing treaty obligations. In practical terms, this meant preventing Apache resistance to activities that violated those same treaty obligations. "Sir," Lieutenant Kevin Murphy approached Caldwell's command tent with dispatch messages. "We've received intelligence reports about Apache war parties gathering in the Superstitions. Command wants to know if you require additional troops." Caldwell studied the messages with professional skepticism. "Lieutenant, what's your assessment of Apache military capabilities in this region?" Murphy consulted his field notes. "Running Bear's primary band numbers approximately 60 warriors, but they've been joined by fighters from allied groups. Conservative estimates suggest 200 Apache fighters could be mobilized within days if they choose armed resistance. And our orders are to protect mining operations with 2 companies of cavalry, roughly 120 men." Caldwell set down the dispatches with visible frustration. "Someone in Washington believes we can fight a war while simultaneously keeping the peace." Back in Tombstone, Margaret Sullivan was experiencing her own sleepless night. The Webb Clinic had become an unofficial headquarters for the Apache Coalition, with messengers arriving hourly with updates from Phoenix, scouting reports from the mountains, and news of territorial government activities. Eleanor Webb found Margaret standing in the clinic's herb garden as sunrise painted the eastern sky crimson. The Irish immigrant was tending to plants that Little Hawk had taught her to identify: desert sage, prickly pear flowers, and various medicinal roots that Apache healers had used for centuries. "You're up early," Eleanor observed, joining Margaret among the carefully tended plants. "Couldn't sleep. Keep thinking about what Little Hawk told me about her grandmother's stories, about the earth remembering who shows respect and who shows greed." Eleanor studied Margaret's profile in the morning light. "You've changed considerably since the auction. The frightened immigrant I first met has become someone quite different."
Margaret paused in her gardening, considering Eleanor's observation. Maybe I was always this person, but the indenture system was designed to crush anyone who showed independence. Running Bear's gift didn't just buy my freedom, it reminded me who I was before desperation forced me to accept bondage. Their conversation was interrupted by hoofbeats approaching at dangerous speed. Carlos Mendoza's horse slid to a stop outside the clinic, the vaquero's face grim with urgent news. "Señoras," Carlos called out, dismounting quickly. "The survey teams have moved beyond the foothills. This morning, they began marking trees within the sacred boundaries themselves. Stone Eagle's warriors are watching from concealment, but their patience grows thin." Margaret and Eleanor rushed inside to wake Dr. Webb, who'd fallen asleep over his medical journals while preparing expert testimony for the court ruling. The three of them gathered around Carlos as he spread his own hand-drawn map across the clinic's examining table. Here, Carlos pointed to marks he'd made near the mountain peaks. They've established what they call preliminary extraction sites. Heavy equipment is being transported up the old mining roads. They're moving as if the court has already ruled in their favor. Dr. Webb studied the map with growing alarm. If they've moved operations into treaty-protected areas before receiving legal authorization, they're in direct violation of federal law. "Unless someone gave them advance authorization," Margaret said quietly. "Carlos, did these survey teams show you any documentation?" Carlos nodded grimly. Papers signed by someone called Deputy Territorial Administrator Harrison, Vale. Never heard of him before, but the documents looked official enough to convince the soldiers escorting the mining teams. Eleanor Webb moved to the clinic's telegraph key, which Dr. Webb had installed for communicating with medical colleagues across the territory. "I'm sending word to Judge Blackwood immediately. If mining operations have begun without court authorization, it changes everything about today's hearing." As Eleanor tapped out her urgent message, Running Bear arrived with three of his senior warriors. The Apache leader's usually calm demeanor showed cracks of barely controlled anger. "My scouts report machinery noise from the sacred peaks. White men with steam-powered equipment are digging where my ancestors' spirits rest. The violation has already begun." Stone Eagle, Running Bear's brother, spoke with the voice of a warrior pushed beyond patience. "The time for white man's courts has passed. They mock our treaties while their machines tear apart our holy places. We should have driven them out when they first entered our mountains." Dr. Webb understood the dangerous momentum building toward violent confrontation. "Joseph, if your people attack the mining teams now, you'll be branded as treaty breakers and aggressors. Federal troops will have justification for military action against all Apache bands." "And if we wait for their courts to protect us," Stone Eagle replied hotly, "we'll watch our sacred mountains become holes in the ground while their judges debate legal technicalities."
Margaret stepped between the Apache brothers, her voice carrying newfound authority. "There's a third option. We go to the mountains ourselves, not as attackers, but as witnesses. Document every treaty violation, every sacred site being destroyed. Force the territorial government to choose between protecting mining companies and respecting federal law." Running Bear considered this proposal carefully. "You speak of walking into danger without weapons, trusting that truth will protect us from bullets. I speak of fighting with weapons they can't use against us. Newspapers, photographs, testimonies from respected territorial citizens. Make their violations so public that hiding them becomes impossible." Amanda Richardson had been listening quietly, but now she spoke with scientific precision. "Margaret's approach has merit, but we need more than documentation. We need irrefutable proof that mining activities are causing immediate environmental damage. If I can gather soil samples, water tests, seismic measurements—" "You're talking about scientific espionage," Dr. Webb observed. "Gathering evidence while mining operations are active could be extremely dangerous." "Less dangerous than the war Stone Eagle is contemplating," Margaret replied firmly.
and more effective than waiting for judges who might be influenced by territorial pressure. Carlos Mendoza, who'd been studying the hand-drawn map, looked up with sudden understanding. There's an old Apache trail that approaches the mining sites from the north, away from their main camps and guard posts. I could guide a small team through terrain their vehicles cannot reach. Running Bear exchanged glances with his warriors, communicating through expressions and subtle gestures developed over years of shared combat experience. Finally, he nodded slowly. "We will combine approaches," Running Bear decided. "Stone Eagle will position warriors to protect our people if violence begins. You will gather evidence of treaty violations. I will travel to Phoenix and demand Judge Blackwood halt mining operations until legal proceedings conclude." The plan required splitting their limited resources among multiple dangerous objectives, but it offered their best chance of preventing either Apache defeat or territorial war. As the group prepared to separate, Eleanor Webb made an announcement that surprised everyone. "I'm going with the evidence-gathering team. As a trained nurse, I can document any medical impacts of mining contamination, and as a white woman, my testimony might carry additional weight with territorial officials." Dr. Webb immediately protested. "Eleanor, the danger is too great. If the mining companies discover you documenting their violations, then they'll have to explain why they're threatening a white woman engaged in legitimate scientific research. Sometimes privilege must be used as a weapon for justice." Margaret looked around the room at people who'd become her chosen family. The Apache warrior who'd bought her freedom, the doctor who'd shown her kindness, the assayer who'd risked her reputation for truth, the vaquero who'd brought crucial intelligence, and the judge's wife who was now risking her safety for Apache rights. "If we're doing this," Margaret said firmly, "we do it completely. Document everything. Hide nothing. Force them to choose between public exposure and private profit." Amanda Richardson was already gathering her geological equipment. "I'll need soil samples from at least 6 locations, water tests from 3 different streams, and photographic evidence of any environmental damage. The Territorial Mining Commission won't be able to dismiss visual proof of their violations." As the afternoon shadows lengthened across Tombstone, the unlikely alliance prepared for what might be their final coordinated action. Running Bear would ride hard for Phoenix, hoping to reach Judge Blackwood before any court ruling authorized expanded mining activities. The evidence-gathering team would infiltrate the Superstition Mountains under Carlos's guidance, documenting violations while avoiding confrontation with mining security forces. Stone Eagle and his warriors would maintain protective positions around Apache camps, ready to defend their families if diplomatic and legal approaches failed completely. Their role required the hardest discipline, maintaining readiness for war while hoping peace could still prevail. "Before we separate," Running Bear said formally, "I want each of you to understand what your courage might cost. If this plan fails, if violence comes despite our efforts, you'll be marked as enemies by powerful people who remember their friends and punish their opponents." Margaret looked directly at the Apache leader who'd transformed her life. "Joseph, you taught me that some things are worth any price. Freedom, justice, protecting people we care about, these aren't negotiable values. If powerful people mark us as enemies for defending what's right, then we'll bear those marks with honor." Dr. Webb checked his medical supplies one final time. "We've all made our choices. Now we see whether courage and truth are stronger than greed and political expedience." As the sun set over Arizona territory, 3 separate groups rode out from Tombstone towards confrontations that would determine whether Running Bear's golden gift had purchased lasting freedom or merely delayed inevitable tragedy. In the Superstition Mountains, ancient spirits prepared to witness another test of whether human beings could choose wisdom over wealth. But in boardrooms across the Southwest, mining executives were celebrating premature victory. convinced that Apache resistance would crumble before superior firepower and legal authority. They had yet to understand that some battles are won not through strength, but through the willingness to sacrifice everything for principles that matter more than survival itself. The desert night settled over Arizona with deceptive calm, while forces that would reshape the territory's future moved through darkness toward their appointed destinies. Dawn broke over the Superstition Mountains with unnatural stillness, as if the desert itself was holding its breath. Margaret Sullivan crouched behind a massive boulder, watching steam-powered mining equipment tear into sacred Apache burial grounds 300 yards below. The mechanical screams of metal cutting stone echoed off canyon walls like the cries of wounded spirits. Beside her, Amanda Richardson meticulously documented the destruction through her surveyor's telescope, sketching locations and noting geological damage that would take centuries to heal. Eleanor Webb tended to Carlos Mendoza's injured shoulder, where a mining guard's warning shot had grazed him during their approach to the evidence-gathering site. "The water contamination is worse than I feared," Amanda whispered, showing Margaret soil samples that were visibly discolored. "These chemicals from their extraction process are flowing directly into streams that supply Apache camps and white settlements downstream. This isn't just treaty violation, it's environmental poisoning on a massive scale." Margaret studied the mining operation through Amanda's telescope, her anger growing with each mechanical assault on the mountainside. The miners worked with systematic efficiency, clearly following predetermined plans rather than exploratory surveys. Someone had provided them with detailed knowledge of gold deposit locations. "They're not surveying," Margaret observed. "They already know exactly where to dig. This entire preliminary assessment was a lie to buy time while they positioned equipment." Carlos winced as Eleanor cleaned his shoulder wound, but his vaquero's eye remained focused on the mining camp's security arrangements. 12 guards that I can count, all carrying rifles. 2 men on horseback patrolling the perimeter. They're organized like a military operation, not a commercial venture." Eleanor finished bandaging Carlos's shoulder and moved to photograph the environmental damage with a camera she'd borrowed from the Tombstone newspaper. "If we can get these images to Judge Blackwood before he rules." "The court hearing ended yesterday," Margaret said grimly. "Whatever Blackwood decided, it's too late to influence his judgment. We're gathering evidence for what comes after his ruling." 50 miles south in Phoenix, Running Bear had arrived at the courthouse to discover that Judge Blackwood's ruling had been postponed indefinitely due to additional territorial consultation requirements. The Apache leader sat in the courthouse lobby, still wearing his dusty traveling clothes, watching territorial officials hurry past with documents they seemed reluctant to discuss. "Mr. Running Bear," Daniel McKenna approached with legal papers and a worried expression. "There's been a development that changes our entire situation. Judge Blackwood received federal instructions to delay his ruling pending review by the Territorial Supreme Court." Running Bear studied the lawyer's face carefully. "Federal instructions, or federal pressure applied by territorial mining interests?" McKenna's hesitation provided the answer. "I've been unable to determine who specifically requested the delay or why federal officials chose to intervene at this critical moment, but I've heard rumors about significant political pressure from Washington." Through the courthouse windows, Running Bear could see federal troops establishing defensive positions around government buildings. Major Caldwell's cavalry wasn't just maintaining general order, they were specifically protecting territorial officials from potential Apache retaliation. They delay justice while their miners destroy sacred land. Each day of legal postponement allows more desecration, more theft, more provocation designed to force my people into violent response. McKenna shuffled through his legal papers, searching for options that seemed increasingly limited. "Joseph, I've filed emergency injunctions demanding immediate cessation of mining activities pending court resolution. But territorial judges are claiming they lack jurisdiction over federal treaty enforcement. And federal officials claim they cannot intervene in territorial development disputes. So Apache sacred sites remain unprotected while white lawyers debate jurisdictional technicalities." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of an unexpected visitor. Father Miguel Santos entered the courthouse lobby carrying travel bags and wearing the determined expression of a man on a divine mission. "Joseph, Daniel, I've traveled from Tombstone to testify on behalf of Apache treaty rights. As a Catholic priest, I have official standing to address matters of religious freedom and sacred site protection." Running Bear studied the priest with cautious respect. "Father Santos, your faith teaches compassion, but your church has not always protected Apache spiritual practices." "Which is precisely why I must speak now," Father Santos replied firmly. "The Catholic Church has often failed indigenous peoples, prioritizing conversion over respect. Today offers opportunity for redemption, standing with Apache believers rather than attempting to replace them."
McKenna immediately recognized the strategic value of religious testimony. "Father Santos, your involvement could reframe this entire dispute. Religious freedom arguments carry significant weight in federal court, especially when supported by established Christian authorities." In the Superstition Mountains, Margaret's team had moved closer to the mining operations, using ancient Apache trails that Carlos navigated with increasing difficulty. The landscape had been scarred by heavy machinery, traditional paths blocked by equipment or guard stations. "The destruction is systematic," Amanda observed, taking precise measurements of excavation sites. "They're not just extracting gold, they're obliterating every trace of Apache presence. Burial mounds flattened, ceremonial circles destroyed, sacred springs contaminated by mining runoff." Eleanor Webb photographed evidence with the methodical precision of someone documenting crimes for prosecution. "This isn't accidental cultural insensitivity. This is deliberate erasure of Apache history from their own homeland." Marguerite felt rage building in her chest as she witnessed the systematic destruction. "They're not just stealing gold, they're stealing memory, identity, spiritual connection. They're trying to make it as if Apache people never existed here." A sudden rifle shot echoed through the canyon, followed by shouted commands from the mining camp below. The evidence team froze behind their boulder shelter as armed guards began systematic sweeps of the surrounding terrain. "Someone spotted us," Carlos whispered, checking his own rifle. "We need to retreat before they bring up reinforcements." But as they prepared to retreat, Eleanor Webb noticed something that made her gasp. "Look at the mine entrance. There's someone down there who doesn't belong." Through Amanda's telescope, they could see a figure in Apache clothing being forced to work alongside white miners. The person moved with obvious exhaustion, supervised by guards who carried clubs alongside their rifles. "They've captured Apache people for forced labor," Marguerite breathed, "using them as slaves in their own sacred mountains." Amanda adjusted the telescope focus, trying to identify the captive worker. "It's a young man, maybe he's 16 or 17. He's wearing traditional Apache clothes, but his movements suggest injury or illness." Marguerite's blood boiled as she recognized the terrible irony. Running Bear used sacred gold to free me from bondage, and now they're using that same gold discovery to enslave Apache youth. Carlos studied the mining camp's defensive positions with tactical awareness. Getting closer for identification would require fighting our way through their guards. We don't have the weapons or numbers for that kind of assault. "Then we document what we can and get this evidence to people who can take action," Eleanor said firmly, continuing her photography despite the increasing danger. As rifle shots grew closer, the evidence team began their careful withdrawal through terrain that offered concealment, but little protection from determined pursuit. Behind them, the mechanical destruction of Apache sacred sites continued with industrial efficiency. In Phoenix, the Territorial Supreme Court had finally convened an emergency session. Chief Justice Alexander Wright, appointed by federal authorities specifically to handle complex territorial disputes, presided over proceedings that would determine the fate of both Apache treaty rights and territorial mining development. The courtroom was packed beyond capacity, with territorial officials, federal representatives, mining company lawyers, and Apache advocates all vying for space. Running Bear sat beside Father Santos in the front row, both men understanding that this hearing would likely be their final opportunity for legal resolution. "This court,"
Chief Justice Wright announced, must balance federal treaty obligations with territorial development rights, religious freedom protections with economic necessities, and establish legal precedents with evolving territorial needs. William Brennan III had traveled from Phoenix, his headquarters, to personally observe the proceedings, understanding that his company's future expansion depended on today's ruling. He studied Running Bear with the calculating gaze of a businessman evaluating an obstacle to be removed or circumvented. Marcus Webb presented revised geological surveys that minimized environmental dangers while maximizing economic projections. Your Honor, independent analysis confirms that mining operations can proceed with minimal ecological impact while generating unprecedented territorial revenue. The economic benefits far outweigh speculative concerns about cultural disruption. But Father Santos's testimony created an unexpected moral dimension to the legal proceedings. Your Honor, as a representative of Christian faith in this territory, I must speak against the systematic destruction of any people's religious sites. The Catholic Church's historical treatment of indigenous spiritual practices has often been shameful, but we can choose a different path today. Chief Justice Wright listened with obvious interest as Father Santos continued. Religious freedom cannot be restricted to practices that resemble Christian traditions. Apache's spiritual connection to their ancestral landscape deserves the same legal protection we would demand for our own sacred sites.
Crawford immediately rose for cross-examination. Father Santos, you're asking this court to prioritize vague spiritual claims over documented economic benefits that would improve living conditions for all territorial residents, including Apache communities. I'm asking this court to honor promises made in federal treaties, Father Santos replied firmly. When the United States government signs agreements recognizing Apache sacred sites, those agreements must be respected regardless of subsequent economic discoveries. The testimony continued through the morning, with each side presenting increasingly sophisticated arguments about treaty interpretation, territorial jurisdiction, and federal authority. But the legal debate was interrupted by urgent news from the mountains themselves. Deputy Sheriff Martinez burst into the courtroom carrying telegraph messages that had just arrived from Tombstone. Your Honor, I have emergency reports of ongoing mining operations in treaty-protected areas, conducted without proper legal authorization. Chief Justice Wright called for immediate recess while he reviewed the emergency communications. The telegraph messages, sent by Eleanor Webb from the clinic, provided detailed documentation of mining activities that had begun before any court ruling authorized them. McKenna immediately demanded emergency injunctions to halt all mining operations pending investigation of unauthorized activities. Crawford argued that preliminary geological work fell within existing territorial permits and didn't require specific court authorization. But the most damaging revelation came from Amanda Richardson's preliminary geological analysis, transmitted through Eleanor Webb's telegraph key. The scientific evidence revealed that mining activities were already causing measurable environmental contamination that threatened water supplies for both Apache and white communities. Your Honor, McKenna declared, these mining operations represent immediate public health dangers that transcend treaty questions. Territorial law requires cessation of any activities that threaten community water supplies. Brennan leaned forward in his seat, calculating rapidly. If the court halted mining operations for environmental review, his company would lose millions in first-mover advantages to competitors who are already mobilizing their own operations. He scribbled a quick note and passed it to Crawford. Offer territorial revenue sharing. Promise Apache communities direct compensation from mining profits. Crawford rose immediately. Your Honor, my clients are prepared to offer unprecedented revenue sharing arrangements with affected Apache communities. Rather than prohibiting beneficial development, the court could mandate compensation that would provide Apache bands with permanent economic security. Running Bear stood without being recognized, his voice carrying clearly across the courtroom. Your Honor, they offer us money from the sale of our ancestors' bones. Would you sell your grandmother's grave for gold? Chief Justice Wright studied Running Bear with growing respect. Mr. Running Bear, the court understands your spiritual concerns, but we must also consider the practical benefits that mining revenue could provide for Apache communities, schools, medical facilities, infrastructure improvements. We have our own ways of teaching children, healing the sick,
and building what we need. We do not require white men's gold stolen from sacred ground to live with dignity." The courtroom fell silent as the fundamental incompatibility of worldviews became clear. No legal compromise could bridge the gap between people who saw land as a commodity and people who understood it as a living spiritual entity. Outside the courthouse, federal troops were receiving new orders from Washington. Major Caldwell read his updated instructions with growing unease. Protect territorial mining operations by any means necessary. Apache resistance to legitimate development activities should be considered hostile action requiring military response. The legal hearing was ending, but the real battle for the Superstition Mountains was just beginning. 3 days later, as federal troops positioned themselves around the Superstition Mountains and mining companies celebrated their legal victory, the earth itself decided to render judgment. It began with a tremor so slight that only Apache elders, trained to read the mountain's moods, recognized its significance. Margaret Sullivan felt the ground shiver beneath her feet as she worked in the Webb Clinic, treating Apache refugees who'd fled the mining invasion. Through the window, she could see dust clouds rising from the sacred peaks where steam-powered equipment continued its relentless destruction. "The mountain is angry," Little Hawk said quietly, her young voice carrying ancestral wisdom. She'd been helping Margaret prepare medicines when the tremor struck, and her reaction was immediate recognition rather than surprise. Eleanor Webb looked up from her patient records, confusion evident on her face. "Little Hawk, what do you mean the mountain is angry?" Before the child could explain, a second tremor shook the clinic more violently. Glass bottles rattled on shelves, and outside horses whinnied in distress. This time, even the white settlers recognized something significant was happening.
Carlos Mendoza burst through the clinic door, his face flushed with excitement and fear. "Señoras, something incredible is happening in the mountains. The mining equipment has triggered landslides, but not random ones. The slides are precisely targeting the extraction sites while leaving Apache camps untouched." In the Superstition Mountains, Amanda Richardson was witnessing geological phenomena that challenged everything she understood about mineral extraction and seismic activity. The carefully planned mining operations were collapsing, not from Apache resistance, but from the mountain's own structural rebellion against the violence being inflicted upon it. "This is impossible," she murmured, watching tons of perfectly stable rock suddenly cascade down canyon walls, burying million-dollar equipment while leaving nearby Apache ceremonial sites completely undamaged. Landslides don't discriminate based on moral judgments. The young Apache man who'd been forced into slave labor was freed when the mine entrance collapsed, trapping guards but creating escape routes that seemed designed by geological intelligence. He stumbled toward Amanda's position, his traditional clothes torn, but his spirit unbroken. "The spirits of our ancestors protect their resting places," he told Amanda in English mixed with Apache phrases. "White men think earth is dead rock to be broken and sold. But earth is alive, and it chooses who deserves its gifts." Meanwhile, in the mining company's main camp, Marcus Webb watched his carefully orchestrated operation dissolve into chaos. Equipment worth hundreds of thousands of dollars lay buried under precisely targeted rock slides. Workers fled in panic as the ground beneath their feet became unreliable. "Sir," his foreman approached with obvious terror, "the men are refusing to continue work. They're saying the mountain is cursed, that Apache spirits are fighting back. Half the crew has already packed up and left." Webb studied geological maps that no longer seemed to match the reality surrounding him. Superstition and cowardice. These are natural seismic events triggered by our mining activities. We adjust our approach and continue operations. But even Webb's confidence wavered as he watched another precisely targeted rockslide bury their most expensive steam excavator while leaving Apache burial markers completely undamaged just yards away. In Phoenix, federal officials were receiving reports that defied rational explanation. Major Caldwell read dispatch after dispatch describing mining equipment destroyed by geological events that seemed to target only corporate operations while leaving Apache communities unharmed. "Sir," Lieutenant Murphy reported, "the mining companies are demanding military intervention to protect their operations from what they're calling Apache geological sabotage.
They claim Apache shamans are somehow controlling seismic activity. Caldwell studied the reports with professional skepticism. Lieutenant, Apache warriors are skilled fighters, but they don't command earthquakes. What we're seeing is environmental consequence, not supernatural warfare. Then how do you explain the selective nature of the destruction? Every landslide has targeted mining equipment while avoiding Apache camps positioned nearby. Caldwell had no answer that satisfied military logic, but he understood that his superiors in Washington would demand action regardless of geological mysteries. Back at the courthouse, Chief Justice Wright finally delivered his ruling to a packed courtroom where Apache representatives sat alongside mining executives, federal officials, and territorial politicians. After careful consideration of all evidence and legal precedents, this court finds that federal treaty obligations supersede territorial mining permits when they conflict with established Apache sacred site protections. A collective gasp rose from the mining company representatives, while Running Bear felt cautious relief. But Wright's ruling contained crucial limitations. However, the judge continued, the court also finds that mining companies have invested substantial resources based on territorial permits issued in good faith. Therefore, this court orders a structured transition period allowing companies to recover equipment and investments while respecting Apache spiritual sites. Margaret felt her heart sink as she realized the ruling's practical implications. The mining companies would be allowed to continue operations while recovering their investments, which could take months or years while destroying everything the Apache held sacred. McKenna immediately rose to protest. Your Honor, this ruling essentially allows continued treaty violations while providing legal cover for corporate interests. How does a structured transition protect Apache sacred sites from ongoing destruction? Before Wright could respond, courthouse doors burst open as Amanda Richardson rushed in carrying urgent geological reports. Her clothes were torn from the dangerous mountain journey, but her scientific evidence was intact. Your Honor, I have emergency evidence that changes everything about this case. The mining operations have triggered geological instability that threatens everyone in the territory.
Wright reluctantly allowed Amanda to present her findings, though mining company lawyers immediately objected to introducing new evidence after final arguments had concluded. Amanda's testimony electrified the courtroom. Her scientific documentation proved that mining activities had destabilized geological formations supporting water sources for dozens of settlements across central Arizona territory. Continued operations would likely trigger catastrophic landslides and flash floods, affecting both Apache and white communities. Your Honor, Amanda concluded, this isn't about Apache rights versus territorial development. This is about environmental survival for everyone living in this region. But even as Amanda presented her evidence, runners arrived from the mountains with news that made legal proceedings irrelevant. The Earth itself had rendered final judgment on the mining operations. The largest landslide in territorial history had struck the main mining site at dawn, burying equipment, closing access roads, and creating new water flows that redirected streams around contaminated areas. Mining companies estimated their losses in the millions, while Apache communities reported that their sacred springs were running cleaner than they had in months. William Brennan III sat in stunned silence as reports described the complete destruction of his territorial expansion plans. His geological experts couldn't explain how landslides had targeted corporate equipment with surgical precision while leaving Apache camps unharmed. Running Bear stood slowly in the chaos of the courtroom, his voice cutting through the noise of panicked corporate consultations and judicial confusion. Your Honor, the Creator has spoken more clearly than any human court could. The earth remembers those who show respect, and the earth remembers those who show greed. Today, the earth decided who deserves its gifts. Margaret felt tears streaming down her face as she understood the full circle of events that had begun with Running Bear's sacrifice at the auction. The Apache warrior's gift of sacred gold to purchase her freedom had led to the discovery of mining wealth that threatened his people,
But now, the sacred mountains themselves had protected Apache heritage by destroying the machinery of greed. Chief Justice Wright adjourned the hearing indefinitely, recognizing that geological events had rendered legal arguments moot. Mining companies would spend years trying to recover equipment buried under tons of precisely targeted rock, while Apache communities remained secure in their ancestral homeland. Outside the courthouse, Margaret found Running Bear standing in contemplative silence. The Apache leader, who transformed her life with his generosity, now faced the consequences of that gift, both the threat it had created and the mysterious protection that had emerged from sacred ground. "Joseph," Margaret said softly, "your grandmother's stories about cursed gold were true, weren't they? The spirits really do judge who deserves their gifts." Running Bear smiled for the first time since the crisis began. "Irish woman who sings to sick children, my grandmother would say that the spirits were never cursing the gold itself. They were testing the hearts of people who desired it. Those who sought gold for selfish gain found only destruction. Those who used it for protecting others found that the earth protected them in return." Margaret looked back at the courthouse where corporate lawyers were furiously calculating losses and federal officials were revising their territorial policies. "So, your sacrifice at the auction didn't just free me from bondage. It revealed who among us deserved freedom and who deserved the consequences of their greed. The gold I gave for your freedom was always meant to serve this purpose. My ancestors carried it through 7 generations, waiting for the moment when it would be needed to teach the world about justice. Today, that teaching is complete." As they walked together towards the Apache camp, where Little Hawk waited with stories of earth spirits and sacred mountains, Margaret realized that her journey from Irish immigrant to Apache ally had taught her the most important lesson of her life. True wealth isn't measured in gold or land or power, but in the courage to sacrifice everything for people you choose to love. The Superstition Mountains stood silent against the Arizona sky, their secrets safe once more, their judgment rendered with the finality that only the earth itself could provide. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.